Welcome back to Whiskey Wednesday with Vinny's Beverage Depot. I am Pat, of course, with Brett from the Whiskey Hotline. Our special guests today are Simon and Joanne from the Bruichladdich Distillery in Port Charlotte, Islay, and you're both on Islay right now. Although I bet I have the worst internet connection currently. So if I freeze up in an awkward position, Brett, you're going to have to cover for me. So Simon, you are the CEO of this distillery. You've been that way for a while, right? And Joanne, you have some convoluted French marketing firm title given to you about education in some manner, right? What is this title?
Pretty much, yes. My title now is a Brand Academy Manager.
Brand Academy Manager, okay. And you have how did you end up at Bruichladdich as a Brand Academy Manager?
Wow, well, it's been a long journey. I was fortunate enough to start at Bruichladdich back in 2006, which Brett mentioned earlier was the first year he actually visited Bruichladdich and the distillery. I grew up on Islay, so I come from Port Charlotte. My family own Octamore farm, which is a name familiar to you all, I'm sure. And I've been away from school to university, didn't know what to do with my life, was working and living on Islay. Job came up in the distillery and I went for it and I got it. And suddenly it's now 14 years later and I'm still here. And with the business, I did get the opportunity to actually relocate to Glasgow and join the then sales team, which became the marketing team. And a lot of my years have been spent on the road as well as a brand ambassador. So I have visited Chicago in the past, 2018 it was, for the launch of Port Charlotte, and have visited many other places around the world. And then sort of more recently, I got married and my husband also travels. So it was a bit difficult for us both to be traveling. So I accepted a role within the distillery where it was more based at the distillery, which made a lot more sense. My family are here, a lot of my friends are here, and I'm now heading up our Brand Academy program, which is an internal program for people to come to the distillery and learn all about our philosophies and our whiskies and the Bostonist gin as well, and stay with us for a couple of nights and get fully immersed in that. And I should say it's a trade thing. It's not open to the public, unfortunately.
It's a necessary thing too. I mean, considering there's been a dizzying amount of Bruichladdich bottlings over the years. And part of the reason I want to talk to you guys today is about, these Octamore releases every year. It used to be, there'd be an Octamore release once a year or something. And now there's a couple. And what's the difference between the 11.1 and 11.3? And we're throwing this 10-year-old in here now. And you need someone, I think, of your expertise just to help the rest of us decode this own language of Bruichladdich bottlings, and is it peated or isn't it, and how many different casks did Jim McEwen throw it in 20 years ago? Simon, you've been there the whole time, right?
I have, yeah. So I was one of the original team of sort of four, along with Gordon, Jim, Mark, myself, that sort of rejuvenated and managed to repurchase the distillery in December 2000. So yeah, so I've seen it all. Including all of those bottlings that Brett, I remember, very proudly used to say to me, Bruichladdich bottlings used to cover this shelf, and that shelf.
Yes. Well, I don't know if I was so proud. I don't know whether that was a source of pride or a source of complaint. It was, It was one of those two.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, at least one of the genesis of, besides Mr. McEwen and the Ace, there was also, we've recently started bringing in product also from Mr. Renier, who appears to be making every single effort right from the beginning of distillation to do that exact same thing with water.
To make things just as confusing,
just as
many
confusing,
different
because
bottlings.
now just every 2 weeks he does a different farm, which means there are a minimum of 26 different releases every year.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, I'd like to think we've learned a little bit in that we know that. And you referred to it, Pat. I mean, we in those early years, and it was it's what I call it our survival mode. When we bought the distillery, there were 6,000 casks there, and they were all basically between like 84 and 94, so they were all in there. and they were all pretty much the same, apart from a few that were in a few exceptional casks. Bruichladdich wasn't really cared for within White and Mackay,
Right.
and they had all the old barrels were sent there, and they don't do any harm, but they don't help the whiskey, and it was all blending. So that's really when we started sort of our acing program, our finishing program, as many people call it, where we were buying in casks, mainly through Mark and I's wine connections, because my background's wine, as you guys know. And it allowed us to experiment and try things other than sherry, other than bourbon, other than, maybe port and Madeira that were around a little bit at that time. And of course, now, if you look at what's going on, there's a lot of people doing that, but it allowed us to try all sorts of things. And that's when we became slightly the Frankenstein of the single malt industry. We ended up with, the Link series and all sorts of things that you guys will remember very well. But we learned a lot through it. And now I'd like to think it's a little bit more organized than it was then.
Well, and it seems like too that the genesis of all that was also to bring in, to switch, and you mentioned it. I remember Willie Tate talking about coming over from Jura in the 80s and occasionally running, before you guys had it, and running Bruichladdich just to make sure that it would run for a few weeks, just to basically keep the kit moving and so on and so forth. So you guys were not given a lot to work with. Now you're 20 years in a distillation, and I think based on what we have on the shelves now, it's very, very clear that what you guys are doing is a far sight better than what you began with in 2000.
Yeah, I think that's fair actually, Brett, because I think we had the team, Duncan McGilvery and the distillery team came back, so we had all the expertise, we had all this amazing equipment, we only had X amount of stock, but we wanted to push the boundaries, we wanted to understand, coming from the wine background, we wanted to understand more about the ingredients, and this. Because the industry generally, barley is barley. It costs X pounds per ton, and as long as you get the right yield from it and it's efficient, and that's driven by most of the single malt going into blends, and I get all of that. But coming from my background, I mean, we want, we knew about the grapes, about the growers, the terroir of where it came from, the fields, the vineyards, the aspects, the age of the vines. So we wanted just to explore that, and it's taken, that's been a journey really that started from 2002, 2003. So we've been at that for 18 years now, and I'd like to think we know quite a lot about it, and and that now is channeling into the releases that we put out, which I think is what creates a point of difference, which is really interesting to us.
What was the first release from one of those kind of terroir focused, single farm focused releases from Bruichladdich?
Well, the organic we did 2000, I think 2003 was the first, which obviously wasn't released then, but it was the first distillation then. It was probably the 2003 harvest, a 2003 distillation, but probably the 2002 harvest, which was a first organic that we ever tried. And then 2004, I think, was the first Islay barley that was grown.
And it was by as well,
by one of our shareholders, Sunderland Farm, and it took quite a bit of persuading. I mean, trying to get a farmer to be persuaded to grow barley on Islay for whiskey production, that has never happened in the history of Islay.
I mean, for people who don't know, that entire idea is kind of mad, in that it's not where you can grow barley well. And
right.
You mentioned earlier yields and stuff, and that's what the whole industry is driven by, is liters of proof alcohol per ton of malted barley, and the yields you get from Islay barley are famously low, right?
So yeah, Joanne, that is your family. So how much, besides your family, how much barley is actually grown on Islay, and what would the more normal use of it be, besides, if there is another use for it? Besides
barley for whiskey distillation ceased to be grown on Islay. There's some arguments. Some say since before World War I was the last time barley was grown on Islay for making whiskey, it would have been grown after that for feeding cattle. That's the main thing you would grow it for. But as Simon says, it's yield, and Isla's not a crop growing area. The crop growing areas in Scotland are mainly on the east coast of Scotland, and that's where you get the majority of the barley grown. So growing barley here, it's a real it was quite a gamble for the original farmers, and it still is a gamble some years for the farmers, because they depend on good weather. They're also fighting it against geese, because on Islay, every sort of late autumn, early winter, we have something like 65,000 geese descending on the island from Greenland. And if you've not been able to have dry weather to take in your barley, then they can decimate fields of barley over 24 hours. So, and that's another thing, we have to wait for the geese to leave again in the springtime before you can plant your barley. So it's a later planting season, and all these things really can affect the yield. And I think on average, you normally get over 2 tons of barley per acre on the mainland. I think you can get up to 3 in Ireland. They've got quite good growing areas there. And Islay grown barley tends to be about 1.5 tons. So you are getting quite a bit less than that.
Yeah. I mean, that's an appreciable amount less. It's wow.
Yeah.
And then when you talk, and then what you get, and I know that Pat was talking about yield, and that usually is somewhat associated with moisture content primarily, right? So you tend to get barley grown there. Part of the yield issue, not just what grows, but also the alcohol yield from the actual product, has a lot to do with moisture content. Is that correct?
Moisture content, as far as I'm aware, is more about the storage of it before you're getting to the actual malting stage. And that was a real issue for us in the early days, because the barley would need to be shipped from Islay. So for those that don't know, we don't have maltings on site at Bruichladdich Distillery. We work yet coming to that. So I've been saying it since 2006. I'm sure you've been saying it since longer than that, but so since just after 2001, we've been working with Beard's maltings in Inverness, who have very much been our partners over the years, who've with us when we've come up with crazy ideas of making super heavily peated whiskey using super heavily peated malted barley, and having lots of small batches of barley, keeping farms separately, keeping different growing areas separate, and also organic barley as well. So they've really been fantastic to work with over the years. We see them as our friends and our partners. And so we need to ship the barley from Islay to Inverness. And you need to have, I think it's a moisture content originally of about below 20% at the original. Percentage aren't my strong point. And it can spoil. And we invested in a barley drying facility with a farm on Islay now, so that we can collect in all the barley, store it here to keep the moisture content down before we ship it up to Inverness.
And then are you able to do that? Is that done as a collective for all the different small areas that are growing barley? So, or is that on a farm by farm basis?
So it's the barley drying facility is on a farm called Octamore, which is literally 300 yards up the road from me, and all the barley farmers in Ireland, they all dry their barley there, and then farms ship it up there. But as Simon mentioned, we have always wanted to have our own maltings as part of the distillery. It's as we say, the missing piece of the puzzle, because we do strive to do as much as we can on Islay, and finally these plans are becoming a reality. So over the next few years, you will see some changes at the distillery, and we are going to get our own maltings on site.
Where the heck are you going to put it? There's not a lot of space left there.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, Pat. So we have, well, luckily we've got a new warehouse site. So what we've done is we're speeding up the construction of the warehouse site so that we can actually move. We're having to move something like 50,000 casks.
Oh, wow.
From the current site. So as you look at the distillery, the warehouses are on site at the back.
Mm-hmm.
We're moving those to the new site, which is literally half a mile down the road. And that means that we'll create space on site for the maltings. Yeah.
Are the new warehouses built in a similar fashion to the old ones? Or are you trying to keep a kind of consistent, I guess, microclimate or something in them? Or is it going to be palletized versus old dunnage warehouse?
It's a really good question, Pat. It's a really good question, because I'll be honest, when we were independent and ourselves, building warehouses, which we had to do almost every 2 years, they're expensive. You've got to raise more money, you've got to go to the bank, and they're actually not very pretty. And of course, we started doing what actually the industry does pretty much globally. We started palletizing. But actually, with hindsight, we probably weren't that comfortable with it. So all the new warehouses are racked.
Okay.
So everyone is racked, and so you can get to every individual cask. You've now got the circulation of the Islay sea air around every cask. So all the ones that we're moving there are the ones really that, well, not all of them, but some of them were the ones that have been on pallets for a while. And so we wouldn't palletize anymore going forward. No.
Okay. Well, I mean, we haven't really touched on much of the whiskey yet. I suppose when you're talking Bruichladdich, you normally start with the kind of classic non-peated Bruichladdich, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because you alluded to this at the start, Pat, when you were sort of having a go for the madness of what we did. And we did, Bruichladdich, pre-1962, this is a bit of an ongoing debate, pre-1962, 6162 was peated. And at that point, the owners decided to go unpeated, because don't forget, back then and still today, most of the production of single malt distilleries goes into blending. Yeah. So the fact is, they saw there was a bigger opportunity for blended whiskey component to be unpeated, and also to sell it as a single malt unpeated. So they took away then the maltings floors, they took away the furnace and everything else, the kiln, and then Bruichladdich went unpeated. So Bruichladdich was unpeated right the way through. So it was sort of seen as not really very Islay, but it's a bit like anything. I mean, most of us know a bit about wine as well. People say, "Oh, I love Chablis." Well, there are heavily oaked Chablis and then are unoaked Chablis, Yeah. And it's the same on Islay. Islay goes from unpeated Bruichladdich to Bunnahabhain very lightly peated to, through the rest of them, Bamore, Coughlin, right up to the heavy stuff with Octamore at the top end. So within it, once you get into the detail, there's a whole range. But the simple fact is, I think we always felt, and Jim certainly felt this, that, Bruichladdich was felt on Islay, for those distillers who were born and bred on Islay, wasn't a true Islay. And that's why we started producing, actually, the very first thing we produced in May 2001 was heavily peated. And we called it Port Charlotte. And before that was ready, and before Port Charlotte was released, we started mixing that with unpeated Bruichladdich. And creating things like, Infinity, Bruichladdich Infinity, right. Bruichladdich Waves, 3D3, all sorts of amazing brands. But it actually became quite confusing, I think, for the punters out there. I'm sure you're all nodding, going, what is Bruichladdich? Is it peated? Is it unpeated? Is it medium peated? So actually, I think it was 2008 or 2009, we decided to start making it very clear. And then we made it ultra clear, from about 2010, 2011 onwards, and said, right, Bruichladdich, the brand, is unpeated. And you're right, we start with the classic laddie. That is our benchmark dram, and which I'm sure is what we're all drinking just now.
Oh, yes, of course.
Which is, so if you buy a Bruichladdich today, it will always be unpeated, okay? And then, our heavily peated stuff, we'll come on to that in a minute, is Port Charlotte, which we started in 2001. And then our super heavily peated is Octamore. So it's much easier, but they are three separate brands, They share the same DNA, the philosophy, but in terms of actually, if you buy Port Charlotte, it's heavily peated, and you will buy Octamore, it's super heavily.
Well,
Hopefully-
so on Port Charlotte, so Bruichladdich is in the town of Port Charlotte, or right outside the town of Port Charlotte, right?
They're just connect you there because they're
Actually,
just not quite. They're
Right.
separate villages.
Separate.
Okay.
Okay. So
Yeah.
so you guys also, there was a distillery traditionally called Port Charlotte, correct? That
Well,
is
Lockendale,
along.
actually, it was
Yes.
called.
Okay, what is called?
It was called Lockendale Distillery.
Okay,
Okay.
so that was Lockendale Distillery. Now, there was some discussion of you guys possibly being involved in purchasing, resurrecting. Where does that stand with an actual Port Charlotte distillery?
I'll try and give you the quick answer to that because there's a long one, but we haven't got time.
Right.
You're right. We got a bit overexcited, and we thought because we own the warehouses, the old Lockendale Distillery warehouses, and some land that's right in the centre of Port Charlotte Village. And as we had started creating the spirit Port Charlotte, at one point we thought actually Port Charlotte could have it. It would be great to have its own home. So we went through planning permission, design, the whole lot. We got planning permission. We actually at one whiskey festival, I think we did like the first cut of the land about to start.
Right.
And you know, it was a great idea, but there were two problems with it. One was I'm not sure at that time we'd proved that we were going to be successful enough to get our shareholders to invest in it, which might mean we would need to go to new shareholders, which would then create a conflict with our existing shareholders. But two, it was coming up to the banking crisis as well. So it was all getting a bit tricky. And then actually the SWA enforced some new rules. That's the Scots Whisky Association that basically control, for some of the listeners that maybe don't know, that control the sort of enshrined in European law rules that control whisky. That's all about to change, but it come January, if the UK does leave with Brexit, is they said once you've established a brand at a distillery, you can't move it. So actually, what you'd have to do is you'd have to sell all the liquid as Port Charlotte was produced at Bruichladdich, prove you had none, and then restart it down the road. So actually. And we had capacity still at Bruichladdich. We're still under capacity. We're not at full capacity. So actually, it made no sense. So we'd have to create a new brand down the road. So that's actually, so, you know, it's on the back burner. We've still got live planning permission.
Well, resurrect Lockendale.
Well, yeah, we own the brand name.
Right. Never with Bruichladdich.
You never say never, you know? You never say never. So maybe one day. You're absolutely right, Brett. Yeah.
So we still have our warehouses in the village of, or some of our warehouses in the village of Port Charlotte, and they're really stunningly old, atmospheric, lovely warehouses to mature our whiskey in, and they're traditional dunnage ones down there.
Yeah, it's a great spot. Yeah, exactly.
Which do you guys prefer? If you're going to grab one whiskey, are you reaching for peated or unpeated?
I'm unpeated, I must say. I mean, you know, I love our peated stuff, you know, technically. And when I do drink it, you know, and I'm going to drink some tonight, I love it. And I think it's probably because I'm from a wine background, you know, my palate, you know, I love our unpeated spirit. I really do. And so I tend to go to Bruichladdich and I move through the range when I want a dram. You know, classic is my go-to dram. I think it represents everything that we stand for. I think it's such a refreshing, mouth-watering dram. You know, as you know, it's unchill filtered. It's at 50% alcohol, so there's loads of flavour in there. I think, you know, Jim always did a great job. Adam has continued to do a great job with it. I think it's the blender's art in that single malt dram, because that's absolutely what the classic laddie is. And I just love it, you know, and I love it in the summer, you know, on ice. I often have it in a highball because it's unchill filtered. You know, it can handle it because you don't dilute it. It doesn't become, you take a 40% whiskey that's been chill filtered and you put loads of other liquid in it or loads of ice, you tend to lose the flavor, in my personal view. But
I'd agree. Yeah, this is a really, you said mouth-watering, and it really is. It's just juicy and fruity and rich. It seems, it's been a couple years since I tasted it probably, and it seems to be drinking a bit more mature, I think, than I would have said it did maybe 8 years ago or so. What's the range of age that we're going to find in this bottle?
It is. It's a really good point, Pat. It's about 8 years minimum in it at the moment, where it used to be about 5. And I think it's an important, particularly for the punters listening, age is we banged on about age a lot because the industry generally use it as the standard, because they can't talk so much about the barley. They talk about the wood much more now, but we can talk about 20 aspects of the classic laddie. Age is one of them. And you know what? If you have great ingredients, you mature it, you blend it carefully. I mean, I don't care whether it's 3 years or 25 years. If it's been put together well, I'm very, very happy about that. And I know people are suspicious of non-age statement because people have run out. Some of the bigger guys have run out of enough stock, and they think, well, now they're pulling the wool over our eyes, and the price is higher than the age statement. And I get all of that, and I'm not going to.
But you just froze. But you just encapsulated. That was the problem with NAS when people, because they were running out, but they were so disingenuous from very, very large companies. Perhaps the largest whiskey producing company on the planet was the worst, because they introduced NAS that were a price point higher than what they were trying to fill a supply gap for. And it just made sense. I mean, we're not going to name names, but virtually everybody that did an NAS were not only trying to solve a problem, they were greedy when they did it. And I think that set back people's perception of NAS because of the way they did it. Instead of, there are other ways to explain it, but you try to foist this off as some sort of super premium product, when in reality, all you're doing is trying to use up younger juice while you're waiting for some of it to get older. Really set the whole industry back in terms of trying to introduce those products.
Yeah, I would agree. And ultimately, I think where they really struggled, and I think where they fell down, is the fact that they thought they could get away with that on their reputation, but actually they couldn't talk about the detail of the liquid. They were all given some kind of sexy name,
right?
They could talk about the wood, because actually they couldn't talk about, anything pre that, before that point. And so, whereas I've always felt that, we started with non-age statement. Well, when we released, we had a 10, a 15, and a 20, but soon we were going to run out of spirit, because we had just those 6,000 casks, and they were getting too old to put into 10-year-old. So we then went to a 12, as you will remember, and we had 17 rum finish and all those kind of things. And then we decided to release Rocks, Waves, and Peak, which were non-age statement. But we said Rocks is unpeated, it's light, it's crisp, it was in red wine casks, and but we would tell you every detail of it, and the interesting thing is, now our stocks, having been at it for 20 years, are getting quite good, which is why we have no problem doing a Port Charlotte 10-year-old now. That puts it right up against Lefroy 10 and Ardbeg 10 and Lagavulin 12 or 16. And because actually, you know what? It's a marker that people find easy, but we can also give you the full backstory. So, people have criticized us a little bit and go, oh, we said, age doesn't matter. We never said that. What we said was, it cannot be the only marker. It's, of course, age is important. Maturation in wood is important. It's, certainly
100%.
But you know what? Don't hang everything on the age statement. Just
it's only one chapter in the story of that whiskey. There's, especially when you're doing so many creative things with the wood at that distillery. I used to have I probably still have it somewhere in an email folder, but before I was even working with Brett, this was probably 12 years ago when I was still in one of our stores, I had a spreadsheet that I had to use to keep track of all the different Bruichladdich bottlings at the time, with what casks and what bottling strength, and it was pretty funny. Brett sent it out to the stores once because everybody kept calling him, be like, what the hell are all these things?
It's amazing the following you know, those early whiskies have still, and even all those non-age statements, multi-vintages we released, Rocks, Waves, Peat, 3D3, you know, they're the really sought after ones now. You know, I saw someone on a Friends of Bruichladdich Facebook page. I'm sure there's a couple of members there tonight. I saw Derek saying hi in the chat, and he posted a photo of Bruichladdich Rocks, and just the reaction that it gets now. And there was, you know, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And it shows how good the liquid was. You know, there was nothing that we put out back in the day that we weren't proud of to showcase.
That's true, actually. That's a fair point, Joanne. We did some crazy stuff. There's only one thing we ever did that I wasn't proud of.
I think I know what one that is.
which was something that was actually created by our marketing director at the time, it's just survival mode. So I don't blame him for that. You know, we had to pay the bank, you know, and pay the wages, and in fact the mini market for the milk every week, you know. Which was Celtic Heartlands, Celtic Nations.
Celtic Nations.
Yeah.
Which was a blend of Bruichladdich, Scottish single malt, and a blend of Cooley, Irish single malt.
Right.
Which, of course,
we carried that. I remember that.
A lot of people are doing it now, but what you're not allowed to do by SWA rules is bottle it in Scotland. And the whiskey was fine; it tasted great, but actually, everything about the packaging was everything we hate. And luckily, the SWA slapped a notice on us and say that's illegal because you bottled it in Scotland, so you need to withdraw it. I was so happy because I hated that.
And I remember that one. We actually spelt our distillery name wrong on the tin. We missed out a D in the spelling on the back of the tin.
What happens when you let the marketing guys make the decisions?
Exactly.
But I just retasted Port Charlotte 10, and this is, you said, holds its own with anything else produced on that island. What's the ppm on this? I mean, that's something any peat head's always going to ask.
So anytime we make Port Charlotte, we always use malted barley that's been peated to a phenol content of 40 parts per million, and that's the phenol content we state is the phenol content of the barley, and that gives you your base to work from.
So it's interesting to me because the Port Charlotte, and I remember obviously we've been in the business and selling, and again, I think that at one point in time or another, we've sold every single release that Bruichladdich has ever done in this generation since the beginning that's been available in the United States or North America. I remember when PC5, you know, when you're sort of the preview walk up to what was eventually going to be the flagship for the brand was PC5, which quite frankly, to me was, of all of the PC releases, was still the best. That PC5 was stunning.
It was an all-time great, for sure.
Was stunning. And it's interesting that you're doing an NAS, which might be younger age, doesn't really matter, on the Bruichladdich unpeated, when in reality, it seems that in the whole, younger whiskey works better if it's peated generally than younger whiskey that's not peated, just because of maturity. And at least part of it is the peat. If there are still sort of raw wood aging flaws, the peated component will hide some of the raw wood character a little bit, where, you know, and not peated spirit won't. And so the wood can kind of go in and then dissipate a little bit. So it's interesting to me that you've settled on an age statement on the Port Charlotte when you could have gotten away with much younger, and it's not as much of a worry on the other side. Now, that being said, the quality what's in the bottle is very good, so it doesn't matter qualitatively. It's perfectly
I think
fine.
It's, you know what, it's a really good point, Brett. And we debated this long and hard, but we felt that Port Charlotte, we needed to rebrand it and create its own identity, and really. We wanted the backstory because we believed it, that Port Charlotte was more Islay than many Islas, you know, peated, because we do the whole process here, not the malting as Joanne has mentioned, but we are going to do that at some point. And therefore, you know, the thing is, there's so much more to this than just the liquid. You know, the whole Bruichladdich project is a massive investment in Islay and the community. whether it's the farmers, whether it's the other industries associated that we use, our own team that we have at the distillery now, which is, it's about 90 people at the distillery, with another sort of 10 to 15 that we have in Glasgow. I mean, it's a statement of intent of what we believe in. And we felt that Port Charlotte deserves its place alongside the well-known Islas. And to give it its best shot, it needed its own identity, because, as you know, the old Scottish Barley version used to be in the same Oslo bottle as Bruichladdich. So people say it was just a peated version of Bruichladdich, which, yes, in many respects it is. But actually, we've deserved to go up against it. And we've restricted ourselves because we don't have that much 10-year-old liquid. So we can't grow it that much. We can grow it about 10% a year over the next 8, 9, 10 years, and then we can grow it much more. So it is restricted for a while. But to give it a best chance against those boys, we thought putting an age statement on it is going to help it. And well, as you know, it's been extremely well received. We love the liquid.
That's great.
The clients around the world absolutely love it. I think Adam has done a brilliant job with it. So we're really happy. And I think Port Charlotte's on its way. Not too much pressure on it, because we haven't got that much stock of 10-year-old. But it's exciting for the future, I think. Yeah.
No, 100%, which was. And I'm with you on the whole. That not having a place, because most people don't know, not only that, whether it has to be peated because it's on Islay, that besides Bruichladdich, Bunnahabhain, of course, what's commercially released, at least in Bunnahabhain, is basically not peated, or if it is, it's very lightly peated. And the other dirty secret, that the largest output distillery on Islay also makes 80 or 90% of what they produce is also not peated. They just don't release it commercially. Any place.
It's an ingredient,
Right. Sure. 100%.
And
so
Octamore, that's okay. And
it's still wonderful whiskey.
But you're right. I like your terminology. We used to be more controversial than we are today, as you know. But the dirty secret. I think people, we are completely transparent about everything we do. Like we don't do the maltings. Our peat, the peat that we use in Port Charlotte and Octamore is not Islay peat. And people might go, "Oh my God, that's awful." Well, it isn't, because we do our malting at the moment in Inverness. And so it's Aberdeenshire peat, I think, generally. Joanne, I need you to nod here.
It is, yes.
And but we're doing trials with Islay peat. So when we do have our maltings, if we do the Port Charlotte Islay barley and the Octamore 0.3, which is Octamore of Octamore, of course it would make perfect sense to use Islay peat. So we will do some trials, and when we have the maltings, I think that would be a fantastic and interesting comparison, rather than try and pretend it's all the same. We haven't got long enough to go into peat, and the difference of where it comes from, how it's cut, how deep it is, whether it's mechanical or by hand, 100%, all that kind of stuff. But there's a huge, discussion, which is fascinating, and we'll have that, and we'll be very open about it.
Yeah.
Where do you feel on Islay? Because I think a lot of folks who have had a chance to travel there are well versed in the area, the peat area that runs between Port Ellen and Bowmore, right off the road, which I know that Lefroy famously talks about getting all their peat from that area. And Ardbeg, where would you source peat locally on the island once you get there?
We're trying from different sources at the moment. We obviously we know a lot of farmers, obviously, who are growing for us. Some of our ex-shareholders, when we were independent, have got some estates, and we're working with them, and they're allowing us to take some and trial it.
Okay, so that's cool. So you can even have a micro. You can even have like a microclimate of peat.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Because it's something that we all, we get asked about quite a lot, and we don't know an awful lot about it yet because we've never done it before. So it's still a learning process and an exploration process for us, and we will learn a lot. And I think we'll be able to report back a lot, because we've done a fair bit of research with our brand ambassadors and various other seminars, and there's not a lot of information there, you know, in particular about the flavor that peat brings. So yeah, we're looking forward to doing our own exploration.
No, that's really cool. That's really cool to have that ability.
The thing is, this is a journey, Brett, and we're still on it. You know, and the thing is, suddenly, then people go, "Oh, it's 20 years you've been at it. You must know." We don't. We know. I don't know. We know quite a lot, and we love sharing it. But you know, there's 2 or 3 things. There's all the peat stuff. You know, we're still learning stuff about wood. I think, and maturation and where you mature it. I think we're still learning so much about barley. You know, which is really, really interesting, and that's still very exciting to us. You know, really exciting. And there's loads of stuff in the warehouse. I mean, you guys are lucky enough to visit the distillery where you will have tried some R&D that we're doing. You know, but there's still tons of stuff that, you know, the clients, our customers, our friends out there haven't had a chance to taste yet. It's not ready, you know. Biodynamic. Right. We've been doing biodynamic whiskey for years, which is unbelievable. But we haven't got enough time to work out how to get it to market.
Right.
But we will bring it to market.
Well, let's talk about Octamore, I guess. I mean, all this talk about peat, it's you mentioned earlier, it's kind of its own brand now, and it's the 3rd brand. And what we just got recently was 11.1 and 11.3, and then a 10-year-old.
And another release of 10.
Yeah.
And 11.1 and 11.3 have pretty different, I don't have the bottles in front of me, Brett's got them, pretty different ppm content on these now, right?
Yeah. When you compare them to for those at home, we have sort of every year, I'd say now, we have a new Octamore release. And the beauty of Octamore is that the phenol content varies every year, every batch. It's something that you simply cannot control. You know, for every time we make a batch of Octamore barley, we take, or Baird's maltings take 8 tons of peat. They burn it over 5 days, and then they measure the phenol content. And there's all sorts of things that can affect how much of the smoke and how much of the phenols the barley has absorbed from, even from the guy who's shoveling the peat on the fire. Different guys that are doing it in different shifts. The rate that they do it actually makes a difference. So every batch that we of Octamore malted barley comes out at a different phenol content. It's got to be above 80.5 parts per million to be classed as Octamore. That was the original that we did way back in 2002. So even looking at the ones in front of me, the 11.1 is 139.6 ppm, a very important 0.6, and the 11.3 is 194 parts per million. Wow. And these 2 this year, this release in particular, are great to compare side by side because they're very similar. They're 5 years old. They've both matured in American whiskey casks. And the main difference being the phenol content, but also where they're grown. So 0.1s of the Octamore series are mainland Scottish barley.
Okay.
0.3s are Octamore of Octamore. So barley grown on the island of Islay on Octamore farm. So they're quite similar, but then they have their differences that you can taste between them.
So you obviously prefer the family farm one, right?
Of course, yes. My Uncle James would stand.
It is notably peatier. Yes. This is
well, and it's like the first thing that got me at the 11.1 is like, and there's holy bubblegum.
Yeah.
Which I don't normally associate that there's like that, there's that bubblegum that almost like diacetyl, but good diacetyl sort of tropical fruit.
And that's, you know, again, the beauty of Octamore. It's you expect it to blow your mind, to blow your socks off, being super heavily peated, being a relatively young whiskey. And you mentioned before peated whiskey at a young age. It's got something, and at 5 years old, this is perfectly drinkable.
Yeah, no Octamore has ever been what I would describe as unbalanced. You know, like, yes, they're extreme, but it's so well woven between the wood and the barley and the smoke and that earthiness that it's just, they're really beautiful whiskeys. They really are.
And Pat, honestly, Pat, it's so nice to hear you say that, because ultimately that is the most important thing. Because certainly when we started releasing Octamores, as Joanne said, the first one was 80.5, it was 2002, it was probably 2006 that we released it. No, 2007-ish as a 5-year-old, 2008. The thing is, everybody got very excited by the PPM. And they go, well, it's PPM, it's only 5 years old, they're cask strength, so they're all at 60 or 59 or whatever. And everything is all a bit crazy. Whereas actually, the most important thing about Octamore is the distillation, the very careful distillation and the very careful maturation, and then the blending of the final cuvee. Because I think you're right, on paper, this should be horrific.
Yeah.
I mean, you just go, that's just not going to work.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, there are some whiskies out there that are trying to make a statement, and they're sort of peat bombs, and actually they're just not balanced. And to me, balance, I've always used this ever since I've been involved in whiskey, coming from the wine background. It's about balance. You need all of those things, whether it's tannin, acidity, fruit, all those things need to be in a balance. Now, they might need to be in a balance today, but it's not ready for drinking as a wine, because you need certain things to tone down over time, but they need to have the right balance. And to me, that ultimately is what I think we try and do at Bruichladdich. Whether it's classic laddie or whether it's Octamore, a complete extreme end, they need to be balanced strands. And certainly add a little bit of water to these things. I mean, they are a masterclass in balance and flavor, and they're not for everybody. I get that, but they do surprise people, because I think peat levels and peated whiskey, certainly if you're getting into whiskey, and I'm sure most of the people are online tonight, they know our stuff, so they know what they know it and are comfortable with it. But peated whiskey is can be a bit of a shock to people at the start of their whiskey journey. I mean, we've always joked a bit that if the first whiskey, single malt whiskey that you ever drink is Lefroy, you might never drink single malt whiskey again. That's not anything against Lefroy, it's just such an extreme dram.
Sure.
So people build up to it. But I think the Octamores, I mean, they are beautifully put together. They really are beautifully put together, in my view.
Well,
I guess this is
even with the extreme high peat, which is what you go back to, there is more to the whiskey than just peat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, ultimately what is coming around is there is actually more to the whiskey than just, and in fact, I wouldn't even say that in terms of balance, this is one of the higher ppm whiskeys that I've ever had, and it's certainly not the most perceptively peated, just based on the tongue of any whiskey that I've ever had, because there's enough other things.
Yeah. And I think that's what's really interesting about the distillation. The distillation, we don't want those really heavy phenols in the final distillate. So we're very careful. There are a lot of distilleries that might be making different things, and they maybe don't adjust things, or they do or not. I don't know. It's not for me to say. Whereas here, when we're making different spirits, we adjust the mill, we adjust, the mashing, we adjust the fermentation, we adjust the cut points. And you have to do that if you want to make points of difference, because otherwise, it'll be dull and a bit boring, So everything we make ends up as a single malt. We don't sell anything for blending, so we've got to look after it at the front,
Right.
So does Octamore get a broader cut or a narrower cut versus the regular ones? Would be my next question there. I don't know how preserving this much ppm is difficult. I mean, everybody else I've talked to, you lose so much through fermentation and more through distillation and more through aging, and to have something that's still showing like this at 5 years old, I wonder, what decisions in the still house lead to that. I understand that you're not in the still house slaving away on the dials or anything there, but I don't know if that's an unanswerable question or not.
And then what pure alcohol differences are there too in terms of, you know, liters, like basically production liters per ton that you're able to get out of Octamore barley versus in a typical year? Because it's everybody's going to move depending upon the weather, but in a typical year versus
the regular Port Charlotte.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it is different. So certainly that yield in the field is lower, as Joanne mentioned earlier. And you know, it's a bit less when it comes to distillation for sure. To your specific question, we come in later. We start the middle cut later. So we let a lot of that heavy phenols go off with the foreshots at the start. And of course, you know, as Joanne said earlier, you know, that ppm is measured in the barley before distillation.
Yeah.
So that's where it was. And of course, we then manage that a bit because we don't want all of that coming through, because otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation about these balanced rams, you know.
Right.
And you know, and that's what you want to do. We don't create balanced, really interesting drams, you know.
Well, really interesting. Nails that on the head. I guess this is a good time to try to answer this question. Van P asked us a while ago, and I'm not kind of a nebulous question. I wasn't quite sure how to answer this. And he says, I enjoy peated scotch, but I'll admit I kind of just like what I like. What flavors should I be seeking out when I'm tasting? I've tried and enjoyed Port Charlotte. For me, something with peated stuff, I always kind of look for some fruit flavors to kind of complement those meatier, smokier flavors. And I think, you know, Bruichladdich in general shows as a bit of a fruitier dram.
Absolutely.
And,
well,
you know,
Joanne
that's what I would say.
Joanne would put this much better than me, but you're absolutely right, Pat. The simple fact is, we don't want that sort of big punch in the face. You know, we want it to be. Ours is a fruity, smoky flavor. Okay, and that's the way that we make it. You know, we don't want it to be so strong in the phenols where it's a shock. So, you know, as opposed to iodine, you know, that iodine TCP thing, I don't know if that resonates in the US, that you get when you get the really heavy, strong, you know, peaty flavor coming through versus fruit and smoke. So I think with Port Charlotte, you get that classic Bruichladdich flavor, that fruitiness with some smoke. And that's why I think Port Charlotte is a great introduction to peated whiskey. It really is.
Well, and I think that other things that you get that always seem to flow through it's something which is positive. The peat that's not an overtly smoky character is a certain level of mint. I mean, I think that I get a certain level of mint, and something that I look for personally is also sort of a bright cinnamon characteristic, which I think that carries through for a lot. And I associated it's like cinnamon, like sweet cinnamon, not just like a raw cinnamon stick, but a sweet cinnamon character that seems to float through. That's really bright. Maybe that's a piece of the peat that's tying in or latching on to that sweetness, which could be, you know, and the fruity sweetness, like tropical fruit sort of character. It's like the comment that I made about number 11.1 was that sort of bubblegummy, super tropical fruit.
Yeah, I think with the peat with Port Charlotte, you know, you do, as Simon said, it's not the TCP, it's not the robust in your face peat you might expect. It's more like, you know, we kind of say bonfire, barbecue smoke, and it's even hottier, but, you know, we've described it as kind of like pineapple on the barbecue before. It's that sticky, sweet, really intense smokiness coming, you know, through that together, and it matches so well.
And you're controlling that with distillation, which is what you've just talked about.
I think it's really important that, you know, I mean, whether it's Adam, the team, Alan, you know, and they learned from Duncan and Jim. You know, we have a number of sort of distillers. Yes, there's Adam and there's Alan, but the guys, you know, this is not computerized plant. We've you know, a lot of these people, they've been, I mean, you know, Budgie, you know, who's been there for years.
You mean two guys aren't running the show 24 hours?
No, two guys are not running the show. And therefore, you know, they need to be taught. But I think we're producing, and correct me, Joanne, but I think we're producing something like 17 or 18 spirits different distillates at Bruichladdich. Now that is about knowledge of distillation, because you think of Bruichladdich, normal unpeated Scottish barley, you think of Islay barley, organic, bare barley, biodynamic. Then you think of Port Charlotte and what we're doing there, Islay barley and others, and then the Octamores. Then, of course, obviously there's gin as well. Honest gin.
There's no other distillery in Scotland doing something like that. I mean, it's just everything is so run by, you know, chemists and accountants now. It's, you know, we make this one thing and we make it, you know, flawlessly, consistently, and very well, and more power to them for that. And most of them are beautiful spirits, but to have a team of distillers who can nimbly change between all those different things is, you know, it speaks to the handmade nature of it more than anything. You know, when you have, you know, the chemical sniffer on, you know, a GS, you know, MC machine or something, determining what you should be coming off your still instead of these different people making it, I think it's a different style of distillation for sure.
For me, it really hit home, and I've done a couple of night shifts, you know, not just with the stillman, but with the mashman as well. And it was the time where we were doing regional trials, which is taking, you know, the exact same barley variety, grown in the same season, but from 4 corners of Scotland, basically. And, you know, the mashman was there writing notes for whoever was coming on shift next, because he says you can even smell it differently when it hits the mash tun, and he's like, doesn't drain as fast, or, you know, be careful with this. And each one, they've got an impact on it, not just the distillers, but, you know, from the mashman doing the mashing, taking control of it and knowing how to work it and seeing the differences even at that stage. It's really interesting, and that's people, you know, not computers.
Right. But again, it goes back to, it sort of applies this word, and it's a big term worldwide, right? Craft, which is a big term, certainly. Started with the, you know, we'll claim responsibility for it, starting about, you know, 30 years ago in beer. And it's sort of morphed into everything else. And, you know, I dare you, you know, but maybe a better word, especially based on, you know, what Joanne just said, is art. And there's a certain art form, and it's a certain amount of aesthetic appeal that can't be that certainly, if the difference between having a chemistry degree and not having a chemistry degree, if you're skilled, you make it happen because you're an artist, not because you're a chemist. The only difference is, I think, if you're a chemist, you know why it's happening on a molecular level. But other than that, the creation itself is more of a function of art and experience, I think, than it is. You know.
I totally agree. And that ultimately is the beauty of these nuances of difference. And, you know, we don't want to produce just one thing. You know, I just think it's more interesting. And as we go forward, I think, you know, our customers out there, you guys in the trade, you're interested in different things. I think people are, you know, rather than just having the one thing and just hammering it through, and, you know, and I mean, as I say, we're less than we used to be. But that's what makes it, personally, that's why I'm still fascinated 20 years on in what we're doing. And why it's interesting. If we were just churning it out and spending millions on massive, you know, advertising campaigns, you know, it wouldn't do it for me, you know.
Well, because you've been there 20 years, but every day is kind of a new day because it's a consistent evolution. And you obviously have in your mind that there's going to be continued evolution. It's not just that it's been happening, it's that it's continuing to happen. You know, even though you'd think after 20 years there would be some level of maturity that settled in.
Yeah, but also I think it's also important that your team feel empowered to try things. So Adam and Alan try things. I mean, I'm always the last to know now. Like, you know, what, 4 years ago, you know, we grew with Andrew Jones, one of our young farmers, rye on Islay, and we've got 4 years of rye, you know, whiskey, whatever it will be called, you know, in the warehouse, and we don't know when we're going to release it and what are we going to have to call it, because that's another conversation with the SWA.
There's no way we're not tasting those barrels
but you're
next
going to
time
at
we
least
visit.
have some help there, because there are a couple of rye, which I think is
There
are
are
a couple of rye projects going on, which I think in that sense is going to benefit you, that you won't be going it alone necessarily. There will be a bit of a community.
4 or 5. Yeah.
There will be a bit of a community, which I hope that community forms, because I think that the combination, you know, the sum will be greater than the total of the parts.
Yeah.
To a certain extent.
Exactly. And actually, without getting slightly boring, there's actually a good reason for doing it, because it's a rotational crop. So rye is putting back into the field that barley takes out. And actually, I mean, we haven't really talked about our sustainable agenda today, and maybe we can come back to that. And it's so important for us. You know, we bought the Croft farm around the distillery just 2 years ago. And actually, you know, it's probably going to be a 20-year program to get that soil up to the right, you know, level. And can we make it organic? Who knows, you know, but I mean, it's very cool. You know, so this, as I say, whiskey, it's not a sprint, you know, it's a marathon. And a lot of things happen along the way. It's just very cool. Very cool.
I totally forgot about the sustainability thing. We could be talking for hours here. I do want to cover one last whiskey with you, and that's the Octamore 10-year-old now, which I just tasted for the first time since the first release in the States. So it's been a while. And I think this one, you know, blind, I think this is more of that kind of stereotypical Islay whiskey, where it shows more of that kind of rubbery tar note to it. This tastes like a very different whiskey than the last two that I.
Well, like herbal maritime, right? There's a little bit more of that herbal maritime savory character.
Yeah, and it has quite a bit of virgin cask influence in this. So it's had 2 stages to its journey. This, I have to admit, this is the first time I've tried this whiskey tonight, and you know, so yeah, but it's interesting to try some slightly older Octamores. And we had a bit of a debate this week, because you know, we've got a little bit of Octamore that's getting a bit of age now, you know, and you know, 10 is older, and we love it young, and it's important to show it young, but also be interesting. I mean, in a year or so, we'll have some 18-year-old Octamore, and that might be quite cool to see how it's faring, you know.
If you need a market tester,
yeah,
we're Chicago is very open and broad-minded.
We'll clear our schedule.
It would be a wonderful test market for this.
Okay, so assuming we're not in lockdown in 6 months, I'll send you 1 sample, but if we are, I'll send you 1 each.
Or we can just come to Islay if everything, you know, in the rosy world, we'll just come to Islay.
Exactly.
We'll come to Islay right before all the Danish tourists come for Fegiel.
Don't come then. And
never.
And we'll have dinner. We'll have some dinner, and we'll open some nice wine as well.
Indeed.
Well, I think I preferred the younger one, actually. I mean, they're both wonderful, of course, but 11.3 was something else with that.
I think
11.3 is
stuck out to me. I mean, the 10-year-old is nice, and it's funny because we have had previous 10-year-old editions of the Octamore, but I don't think we've had a 10-year-old that's been this high a ppm. I think they've been 167 from memory. And yeah, you're right. It kind of hits you right in there.
Really
you
does.
get a little bit of metallic and a little peat there, but the 0.3, which is not that much less in ppm. You know, when you look at the figures, 194 for the 11.3, 208 for the 10-year-old. But
208, holy cow.
Yeah.
It's funny.
I think the cask maturation makes a significant difference as well. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there was an Octamore. I don't know when. There was a soft turn barrel one that was probably one of my favorites to this day.
7.3. 4.2. 4.2 Comas.
The 2.2 was the Orpheus, and that was a wine cask. I can't say.
No, we keep getting into trouble. We can't mention the chateau names anymore. We get into trouble.
You mean right? Like the
don't mention it.
Don't say it.
The whole Chateau series.
Honestly,
Did once. I actually have. Trust me, I know. I sympathize for another friend of ours from an independent bottler that I'm very close with. Actually had to get me to attest to an affidavit that I had sold all of a particular bottling that had clearly on the label a particular chateau that's
it's
sensitive.
gone. It's gone. It's gone.
Yeah.
Honestly,
Yeah,
it's
no.
gone.
I said, so what do you want me to do? He goes, I'm going to send you an email and ask you if you sold through, and you're going to respond, yes, we've sold out. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. It wasn't such a problem when we were small, but well, we're still small, but part of a bigger group, we need to play the game a bit more when it comes to
Yeah, I mean, you know what I
naming
think?
others.
I think they it's sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because they should actually be happy. If you make a wonderful whiskey, they should be happy for the association. I think the problem is, it's like a lot of people's problem with independence is they're worried that somebody's going to do it and put their name on it and it's going to be crap. And then somehow they're going to be painted with that brush.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. I don't want to take up more of your time. I know it's late there, and I, for one, am hungry for dinner now. But I really appreciate your time today. These are wonderful whiskeys, and it's always good to talk about all the different stuff at Bruichladdich. Obviously, we could do this again and again. We didn't even talk about gin.
I know, but I feel like we could keep going.
We said the word sustainability only 3 times now or something. So there's obviously more to talk about. Maybe the next time we have a release from Bruichladdich, which back on or something. So everybody else, though, thanks for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back next Wednesday with somebody, I forget who. Brett and I will be around on Friday tasting out some single malt sherry barrel aged tequilas. That should be interesting.
Correct.
Yeah, from Partita. So again, Joanne, Simon, thank you both again for joining us tonight. Everybody else, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. So cheers, everyone.
Absolute pleasure.
Thanks, guys.
Good to see you, my friends.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.
Absolute pleasure. Great to see you guys again. Thanks for the support, by the way.
Cheers.
Brilliant. Thank you.
This was
Take
great.
care.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.